I think when we imagine ourselves being on a road to a trade war, one of the first things that we overlook is the fact that we are in a trade war and we're not recognizing it. And the reason we're not recognizing this is because it's a familiar story. We've got slowly evolving circumstances in the economy and demographics, and we're approaching it with a relatively obsolete set of historical lenses and tools and metrics. And consequently, we're essentially missing what's going on. So I don't pay a lot of attention to the long-term implications of the president's proposals, but I do sense that he's tapped into something that is going to cause us to be thinking about the underlying problems. So how did we get here? Well, since the Industrial Revolution, we've had an evolving and continuously improving technological advances. Individually and in combination, they have become the tools for wealth creation. And a part of the consequences of this over time, particularly in the 20th century, we've had radical improvements in transportation and communication. Now, those are platform technologies that have essentially made the world smaller. And so the sort of the abstract implications of that is that we've done away with the friction of time and place. And our companies, the people who have great wealth, they have slowly evolved, and they've left an economy that's focused on individual establishments. And particularly since World War II, we now have a variety of globe-spanning multinational corporations with footprints all over the world where they think there are opportunities. And to support that, we have a global product cycle with the idea of putting production as close to the emerging markets as possible. And all of this has been a very rational approach. At the same time, along the sidelines, the folks with the green eye shades are using essentially double entry bookkeeping, an accounting apparatus that makes a lot of sense for an individual company, but those kinds of issues, those sort of tools, don't make a lot of sense when we're talking about global enterprises, and will make even less sense in the future when we're talking about networked ecosystems, industrial ecosystems. And so one of the pieces of data that come out of the double entry bookkeeping perspective on what's happening beneath our feet is we keep track of pluses and minuses. And the minuses, we have a word for that, that's a deficit. And nobody likes deficits. So before you know it, we're talking about a long-term industrial change that's kind of a morality play. Deficits are bad. Deficits aren't necessarily bad. We've had a trade deficit in the United States with the world that has been negative for 42 years straight. And during long periods of time, those deficits have increased most dramatically during times of rapid economic growth. I'm thinking of the second terms of Lincoln. I'm sorry, Lincoln. He's old. Of Clinton, and as well as Reagan. So there is no reliable relationship between growth and trade deficits. At the same time, we have also taken a look at jobs, and we are bombarded with factoids having to do with the massive job loss. And a lot of that is true, particularly in manufacturing, and particularly with respect to China. At the same time, however, well, just as one of those factoids, 1999 to 2011, we lost 2.4 million jobs in the economy. anything with $1 million, that sounds like a lot. In January of this year, we had total job separations, the negatives, of 5 million jobs. And if you were to take a look at the 2.4 million jobs lost over a 12-year period, you would realize that that is about maybe less than 1% of all the jobs, the hundreds of millions of job losses that are the very definition of a robust economy. Now, I'm going to end this now, but lest you come to the conclusion that therefore we should pay no attention to deficits, I would say this is where we're missing what's going on. We have a major trading partner out there that is violating all the rules that have been carefully knitted together among rules-abiding countries since World War II. And that rogue set of expectations, that dominance in industry after industry is going to be acceptable for managing and monitoring a global scale economy. Will have its day. I suspect we'll get into more of those details in a minute.
Well, I think it's certainly fair to say that our expectations about China over the last 10 years or so have been disappointing, or they haven't been met. When Xi Jinping came into power, maybe you remember all the stories about the year he spent in Iowa as an exchange student, and we were expecting gradual modernization and reform, and as China got richer, there would be more liberalization of the economy and a kind of a movement towards the international liberal economic order. But that hasn't taken place. Instead, Xi Jinping now is perhaps president for life, looking more like a typical communist strongman. In China, instead of just limiting the information available to people, there are sophisticated programs to shape the information made available to people. You've heard about the digital surveillance and widespread use of facial recognition technology. The economy is no longer one that is complementary to our economy, where China would work on some of the less advanced work and we would do the more advanced. So we've gone from complementarity to competition. And that's only natural. China deserves and should be moving up the economic chain. And they've done a fantastic job of moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So there's a lot positive to be said about what's gone in China. But still, the system is not moving towards reform the way we think reform should look. Also, China now has a more robust foreign policy. It's very active in infrastructure building in Africa. If you want to build a dam, you call Sino-Hydro, for example. The Belt and Road Project is well known. Its military is changing from an organization which focuses just on domestic control, more to one which is able to fight in the wars abroad. But in China, like everywhere else, politics begins locally. Politics is local. And President Xi, when he came into power, had a real problem locally. He inherited a kind of an aging and sclerotic leadership group and system, the venality, corruption, and in fact, the very survival of the Communist Party was at stake. And so, locally, for him, job one was to ensure the survival of the Communist Party. So for him, when he thinks about reform, and when China thinks about reform, it's not market liberalization, but rather it's refreshing and revitalizing the Communist Party. Economically, he's faced with a situation where he needs to see between 10 and 12 million new jobs each year to soak up labor in China. And because of the one-child policy, China still, for all its developmental success, faces the risk of becoming old before it becomes truly rich. So, and because of the sort of the inherent corruptions in the communist system, there's also been the problem of political expediency trumping economic efficiency. To get the country moving, the Communist Party has invigorated its role in the economy, and in many of the state-owned industries, there's greater attention being paid to the party representatives. It's almost like the board of directors in an American company. The old implicit bargain with the Chinese people was, leave the party alone and you'll get richer. That's kind of gotten tired, and now there's a more complicated bargain. The people want clean governance, they want the government to be adaptive and able to change with changing conditions, and they need the government to be able to respond and address new middle-class needs and emergencies as they arise. Certainly technological change is seen positively with the advances being made with the high-speed rails, autonomous vehicles, and computer networks. Much of this has come as a benefit, as a result of industrial planning. And China is allowed to do industrial planning. China has a national integrated circuit plan, a national artificial intelligence plan, and now, of course, the 2025 plan, which names a lot of the developing technologies of the world as being something that the country wants to focus on. Again, nothing wrong with that per se, but where we get problems is where there is inherent state control, where there is financing made available with no cost of capital, when the technologies are taken abroad and destroy the nascent competitors in other countries, and then China is left to dominate these technological fields. So there's a contradiction, really, between this state capitalism of China and the global integrated system that we'd like to see move forward. In addition to state financing, I think you're all familiar with the requirements in China that certain companies to go into the Chinese market have to join joint ventures. Often as part of the joint venture, they have to share their technology with their venture partner. And surprisingly, I mean sarcastic, not surprisingly, that technology ends up in other 100% owned entities by the joint venture partner. There's strict requirements for approvals for various licenses, which often require tech transfer. And as you know, the United States looked into this under Section 301 of the Trade Act in '74. This is show and tell. I have to carry all this weight just for this one moment. But this is the report on Chinese technological and IP violations put out by the Commerce Department. And it's a very thorough job. And I can leave it here if anybody wants to read through it, but I won't have to carry it back with me on the plane. There's also in the export field, China has been targeting technologies that it wants to get to and has been providing extra financing and support overtly and covertly for this kind of activity. And beyond all that, there's been outright IP theft. I think you've heard about U.S. Steel's computers being hacked and technology for super hardened steel being stolen. There's a company called American Superconductor, for example, which had one of its employees bribed, and now wind towers in China use American superconductor technology without paying licensing fees. The goal of all this is, of course, economic development, but it's also economic development while keeping the Communist Party in power. And Chinese leaders are willing to take some discount on market performance in order to keep the party in power. Overall, in the economic space, the United States is still very strong, but relatively we're receding. Our numerical volumes of trade with Asia still are high, but we're not, but because of growth of intra-Asian trade, our overall percentage is getting smaller, so our importance is getting smaller. That's why we need to be working with other people, and that's why, in my view, our decision to pull out of the TPP was foolish. Now, the thing which is pointed to most frequently as a sign of our failure, and Don was just mentioning this, is the trade deficit. And the numbers really are staggering. Out of a total $635 billion of bilateral trade, the U.S. exported maybe $130 billion, much of that is agriculture and aircraft, and we imported $505 billion. That's 3.5 times as much for a $375 billion trade deficit in 2017. Economists will tell you that some of this is a result of the United States' low savings rate, and that if the Chinese trade deficit would disappear, we would have trade deficits with other countries. Cynics would say, hey, you know, they're giving us stuff and we're giving them little green pieces of paper. We're getting the better of the deal. But those green pieces of paper are IOUs, and at some point they have a weakening effect on our economic strength. There's something else which is kind of ironic at work here, and that is our system encourages us to go after markets and profits. China is a huge market. I think there are more people in China with income between 50,000 and 500,000 US than anywhere else in the world. And that means it's a huge, huge market. And so US companies naturally want to do what they need to do on an individual basis to get into that market. And sometimes the country on an aggregate basis suffers from that. So with the Chinese cinema market being so large, people are very careful how they write their movie scripts, that they don't offend the censors. China wants research centers in China? Sure. They want limits to data access on websites? Sure. They even want US airlines to refer to Taiwan and Hong Kong and Macau in certain colors and language? Sure. And Delta, in fact, acquiesced, though it's been criticized as having given into Orwellian pressures, but it's done that. So can our market economy coexist with Chinese state capitalism? Or are we entering kind of a battle of civilizations? There's an economist named Michael Pettis, who's got a blog, which I really recommend to you, who describes how the Asian model of development has been to suppress wages and use surplus for capital investment and export. The US model tends to be built from Henry Ford on forward with the idea of high wages and let demand pull economic growth. But can we continue that model when we're struggling in global market competition with people who use another model? Putting it in most stark terms, this is talking about defense. Secretary of Defense James Mattis said, quote, simply, we must be the best if the values that grew out of the Enlightenment are to survive. Perhaps that puts it a little dramatically, but there's certainly a lot at stake here for liberal international values, not just for the US economy, but for the shape of the world in the next century.
So can you describe what's going on in the last 2 months? Give some specific examples.
Well, among the things that I think we've all noticed is a laundry list of individual products coming out of individual sectors that are going to be the subject of proposed tariffs. And it looks almost ridiculous that we would think about managing our economy by understanding, using something that Ed said earlier, how many sneakers we produce. I must say, I think that's a little bit of an eyewash on the part of Washington. The core focus behind that is to demonstrate that these tariffs, if they are imposed, will fall unevenly across the industries in the U.S. economy, to be sure. But it overlooks, almost by design, the fact that these different industries are the subject not only of producers who will bear those costs, but all the consumers who would realize the benefits of getting something relatively inexpensive. In a way, an ironic way, deficits, when you all add up all this, the deficits that we accumulate essentially are what drive economic growth, at least over the long term. And so translating what we see coming on the news these days in the last couple of months to these longer term evolutionary dynamics in a capitalist economy, it's hard to make those translations. I think a lot of people are confused.
Well, in the last couple of months, and why we're talking about this today, and we weren't talking about it a year ago, is that the United States came out with that Section 301 finding. It moved forward with a list of 3 remedial actions. It brought a tariff list against Chinese goods, a proposed tariff, I should say. It's still haven't put it in place. Brought a WTO case on licensing requirements, restrictions in China, and it's talked about potential reciprocal investment restrictions. There's also legislation pending in Congress which would tighten CFIUS, that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, looking at a wider range of investments, and even, and this is controversial in U.S. business, looking at potential joint ventures by American companies abroad. So there's been a lot of activity. China, not surprisingly, has not sat still for this. And when we came out with our list, they came out quickly with a short list, and then a few days later with a second, very smart list, targeted in two ways. In one way, it was for goods that tended to be in states that support President Trump, a lot of agricultural products and Trump voters, but also at industries where the United States has got a great comparative advantage, and I think of industrial chemicals in particular. The U.S. has got, I think, a $30 billion trade surplus worldwide with industrial chemicals. We're very strong there, especially with fracking and the lower cost of natural gas. Our chemical industry is really taking off. So there are a lot of chemicals on the list. So China's not stupid, and their choices have been targeted. And now, of course, we're entering into a phase of negotiations. Now, what are we negotiating? Are we negotiating to try to get some X number of dollars off the trade deficit in the short run? Kind of a tactical short run approach. Or are we looking at really doing what's necessary to open China's market and remove the restrictions so the world can play together and China can benefit from the world system and the world system can benefit from the China?
Well, one of the things that I think is widely not recognized, particularly by people who are handling the policy machinery in the nation, is the importance of the transformation of about every industry that you can think of. Today, competition is driven by innovation. And the engines of innovation are subtle, and they're often intangible. And the idea of an actor in the global economy trying to put constraints or have unfair access to somebody else's intellectual property lets loose what I would call economic cholesterol in the whole system. It imposes costs on both producers and consumers, and it slows down dramatically the ability to generate the next innovation. I would ask you to take a look at any object that you own at home, even look around this room. That chair, for instance. That chair has around it, perhaps you don't see it, a penumbra, a zone of what we might call the adjacent possible. Now, the value of that chair for us is determined by the attributes that are associated with that chair. And that's what the market is going to come up with the value for that chair. That chair or a chair tomorrow will engage the curiosity, the inspiration of some bright mind to add to those attributes and essentially transform that product. That chair will go through an evolution. Market economies enable that process to go forward. And we will have a bundle of new attributes that will reprice that chair and create new jobs, create new skill demands, create new industries, and maybe see the boundaries between industries evolve. States, national governments in charge of that process can't handle that. They can't do that. Tomorrow's value, tomorrow's economy is always coming from within, not managed and dictated from on top. And so this notion of the intellectual property, when you start to put constraints and barriers on intellectual property, you're shutting down your access to tomorrow. You lose track as a nation, our nation, if you lose track of the ability to add to that core of new knowledge and trigger, stimulate the creativity to address the opportunities in that adjacent possible, your economy is in trouble. That intellectual property aspect is far more important than trade deficits in understanding the problems that we face today.
The only thing I would want to add to that is to say we should have confidence in the ability of our market economy to do what Don was saying and to ultimately out-innovate and to grow in a superior way as compared to economies where there's a state command. The issue is keeping the way state command works from interfering with our operation of our economy by, in the short run, putting products on the market that don't carry the full cost of innovation and capital, either stolen innovation or government subsidized capital. You may remember that we were afraid years ago that the Soviet Union would defeat us. And then we were afraid that the Japanese would surpass us. Now we're kind of afraid that China will both defeat and surpass us, which is one reason why there's this sense of nervousness in the economy. But I think that if we're careful and devise the right sensible solutions, we can not only not be defeated or surpassed, but we can also help China move forward and continue with the development for its people.
Well, that's interesting. Since I've already established my credentials with regard to being in touch with Lincoln, let me reach back not so far to about 35, 40 years ago, when the concern, sort of the China issue du jour, involved Japan in the 5th generation computer. And their decision to go after our computer industry, and of course the heartbeat of the computer industry was located just on North Central, the generation of semiconductors. They were going after that because they understood, and I think accurately, that the economy in the not too distant future was going to be increasingly ICT intensive. One would note that we don't have a lot of pressure from Japan anymore. Is that to be taken in a positive way? Well, one of the ways that we responded as a nation, and I must say as Texas, is that we began to rethink the wisdom of universities working more closely with industry. We took some of the safeguards down and started to encourage knowledge creation, leading to being pulled into industry as solutions of different sorts. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, and I don't overplay this too much, nobody paid attention to Austin before Japan's raised this issue in the United States. When Admiral Inman located MCC in Austin, Austin has taken off as a technology hub. The most spectacular growth of any metropolitan area in the country in terms of technology activities. That's the built-in, economists have a word for this, endogenous. That's the endogenous capability of a nation to respond to challenges. And we did so very positively. The last thing I would say about that historical incident or period is that Japan is that much of a challenge anymore. Can we hope that this our situation today will evolve in a similar fashion? There are some differences. 35 years ago, Japan, the Asian Tigers, Korea, Taiwan, they basically were and are today rules-based. They understand the importance of working with other nations. They were aggressive, to be sure, but they value and honor rules. They are also, were then under our security blanket, our national security blanket. In other words, they valued our defense industrial base, and they did not want to isolate themselves from that relationship. And unlike China, however, when the aggressive Asian Tigers dominated the stage, they essentially kept American industry out of their markets. Not good, but that's a better solution. Was an easier solution to handle than the Chinese. The Chinese invite you into their markets. They know how attractive they are. But once they are in, they bend and shape the rules to have unfair access to your technology. So they abuse that relationship. So I'm not so certain that we're going to have the same positive outcome unless we rethink and basically alert our allies, other nation states who value a rules-based global economy, to say this is a common threat. This isn't U.S. against China. This is a common threat, and we need to impose the value of rules-based trade on a country that right now does not recognize that.
Comment and question. I think when the Trump administration announced the tariffs they were going to impose, I thought the primary reason they gave was this intellectual property theft, basically. I don't think they use that word. So hopefully we're on that. The question I've got is the elephant in the room in trade negotiations with China seems to have always been the amount of debt they purchase from the United States. And I haven't heard any discussion of that in these trade negotiations. Can either of you two speak to the importance of that, if it is important anymore?
Well, I think that's a double-edged sword, which is one reason why it hasn't been raised that much. The worst thing that could happen to a holder of U.S. debt is to have the value of that U.S. debt decline, so that there's certainly a disincentive on China to threaten to sell off U.S. treasuries. And I think that, I'm not a financial person, but I think that the market is robust enough that there's not too much concern that they would really, maybe even could destroy the market. I don't know if that's responsive to your question.